Shall we let everybody in?
No, not yet, not yet. When the countdown starts.
Okay.
We're waiting for Javier. The countdown starts.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to HuffPost's live event on Zach Carter's new critically acclaimed book, The Price of Peace, Money, Democracy, and the Life of John Maynard Keynes, which is out now. I'm Lauren Moraski, and I work on strategy and innovation here at HuffPost, and I'll be your host today. We're really glad to see you all. Just a few important things before we get rolling. We want to make this as interactive as possible. So if you can, start your video. You can find that function at the bottom left of your screen. This way we can all see one another. Secondly, we want to hear from you. So if you have a question you'd like to ask live, all you have to do is raise your virtual hand. You can do that by clicking participants at the bottom of your screen, and then you should see a panel open up on the right with a raise hand option. Let's all give it a whirl and try raising our virtual hands right now to make sure it's working for everyone. Cool. I'm seeing some hands there. You can go ahead and lower your hand by clicking that icon again. After you click raise hand today, you'll see a chat message at the bottom of your screen where you'll hear directly from one of our HuffPost moderators. They all have HuffPost branded pink and green backgrounds, so they're easy to spot. And we'll try our best to get to your question. And when it's your turn, we'll call you up live. Oh, and if you do have a question to ask today, I encourage you to click that virtual raise hand button as soon as possible. This way we all have a chance to get to your question. And if you submitted a question during registration, our moderators may reach out to you to see if you want to ask that question live. So check your chat feature periodically so you can see if you have that message. You can also chat those same moderators directly if you have any technical issues or questions about how to take part today. Also, feel free to use Zoom's virtual clap and thumbs up features for a little fun. Oh, and before I forget, if you'd like to support our journalism, think about joining HuffPost membership. You'll get access to our comments section, invites to virtual events like this one, and more. Well, that's all from me for now. I'm going to toss it off to HuffPost Enterprise Director Richard Kim, who'll be leading today's discussion with Zach. Richard.
Thank you, Lauren, and thank you, HuffPosters, for joining us. I'm so excited to be here with Zach talking about his book. The Wall Street Journal called The Price of Peace the best single-volume biography of this intellectual giant. Journalist Zachary Carter has crafted a timely, lucid, and compelling portrait of a man whose enduring relevance is always heightened when crisis strikes. The New York Times raves that it's a brilliantly incisive book. Zachary D. Carter's outstanding new intellectual biography of John Maynard Keynes offers a resonant guide to our current moment. And Zach's old friend, economist Jeffrey Sachs, says that it's a brilliant book, which enables us to understand, to watch the unfolding of Keynes's insights and the development of his practical wisdom against the backdrop of history and his personal life. You can buy The Price of Peace at your local bookstore or online. And before I let Zach talk, we're gonna take our first poll. It's an easy one, I promise. It's just to get us in the habit. So let's launch poll number one. John Maynard Keynes was A, an economist, B, a philosopher, C, the man who socialized British medicine, or D, all of the above. Zach, you probably, if you're like me, encountered Keynes' name first in high school or maybe in an intro macroeconomics class. And you sort of got a very textbook, one-dimensional version of who he was. Who is that person? Who is our common understanding of Keynes, that you went into writing this book?
Sure. I mean, I learned about Keynes, I think, the way most people do in an Econ 101 course. And I learned that he was the sort of deficit therapist guru. He's the guy who told governments that when economies slip into recession, you spend a lot of money, and that helps lift things out of the doldrums and get back to growth. That is certainly part of Keynes's legacy, but it's not the way Keynes thought of himself, and it's certainly not the way he approached his life's work. He never woke up on some day and thought, it'll be really great if I can be the intellectual, sort of legitimization of deficit spending. He was concerned about the big ideas and the big crises of his time, in particular war and international conflict. He comes of age at the turn of the 20th century and believes that he's living in this golden age of prosperity and mutual harmony. And when the First World War hits, he's really emotionally rocked by this event. He's not just saddened by the deaths of his friends, because he has friends who go off and fight for both sides in that war. He is disturbed at the fact that this type of conflict could have occurred while he and his friends at Cambridge and in London were off having garden parties and talking about art and ideas and believing themselves to be moving towards a more prosperous and harmonious future. So he is trying, as an economist, to create a world where things like the First World War don't happen again. And that is the central organizing principle of his thought and his work. He's not a mechanical, arithmetic thinker the way I think the economics profession has made him out to be over the ensuing years since his death.
So one of the keys to understanding that version of Keynes actually are the garden parties, right? And you talk about the sort of significance of Bloomsbury and the Bloomsbury group. What was Bloomsbury, and how did Keynes fit into that social world?
So in the early 20th century, Bloomsbury was an enormously influential group of artists, thinkers, poets, painters, who are engaged in this sort of work of pure aesthetic expression. They believe that politics and war and these types of things are sort of on the way out, that we're moving into a new era of love and harmony where people in London can communicate with people in Paris or Frankfurt or New York or St. Petersburg and be part of the same cultural milieu, where there's this sort of international understanding that's taking place because of art and because of the culture surrounding art and letters. And that this is good because Europe has been at war and in various stages of conflict for millennia, and this is a new sort of opening that Bloomsbury is part of, certainly believes that it is part of. And so the people that John Maynard Keynes is hanging out with in this period of time are people like Virginia Woolf, one of the greatest British writers of the 20th century, people like E.M. Forster, who wrote so many of these beautiful British novels that I think the Merchant Ivory, sweepy melodramas of the 80s and 90s did such a good job bringing to the screen. And there are also a lot of painters who were quite famous at the time. They're not quite as famous now, but people like Duncan Grant, who was one of probably Keynes's most important lover until he meets his wife Lydia Lapokova in the 1920s. Duncan Grant is going off to Paris to hang out with Gertrude Stein. Vanessa Bell, who is also a painter in this milieu, is going off to Paris to hang out with, with Pablo Picasso. And my dog is right here.
Zach's dog does not like Vanessa Bell.
That's okay. Yeah. All right, Pepper, come on, sweetheart. So I have a dog, and I'm living with my in-laws right now because of the pandemic. And my dog is very enthusiastic. She's not a really big fan of the Bloomsbury set, but she does like Keynes. And the thing to remember is that Keynes is often kind of, he has a sort of inferiority complex with these people because he wants to be a cool, awesome artist like Vanessa Bell or like Virginia Woolf. And yet he kind of isn't. He's a beautiful writer, but he can't write a novel and he can't write a poem. And so he's always trying to live up to the expectations of these people in his economic work. And he sees them as sort of a moral beacon. So these people are all pacifists and they are deeply opposed to World War I. But Keynes sort of enters the world stage, becomes a significant person in the 20th century by running British war finance during the First World War. And that is a very substantive job. He's like 31 years old when he's doing this. And he says later that every dollar that passed through the government passed through my hands at this period of time. And of course, World War I is a very expensive event. So his friends are sort of saying, "What are you doing? Why are you, why are you promoting this horrible, pointless war when all of us don't want to be part of it?" And he takes various sort of steps to try to atone for that within Bloomsbury. He formally files as a conscientious objector to World War I, even as he is in charge of World War I war finance. I think it's a remarkable sort of internal contradiction. But we all have these contradictions in our own personalities that seem to make sense to us, but look totally absurd from the outside. And I think the thing that's important to remember about Keynes is he's trying to resolve them. He's not unaware that there's a tension between his Bloomsbury creed and his public life. And when World War I ends in the Treaty of Versailles, which he's just deeply disappointed with, he decides, I'm going to, instead of just live with this tension, I'm going to try to use my public influence to create the kind of world that Bloomsbury believed that it was participating in before World War I broke out, but obviously was not.
So I want to get back to that in 1 second. Can we put up the results of the first poll? It was a little bit of a trick question. Oh, people, you nailed it. Excellent. Thank you. So, let's just set the scene. It's the Great War has ended. It's 1919. Keynes was working in the Treasury. He's sent off to advise the Paris Peace Conference. And you argue that this is really a definitional moment for him. It sort of crystallizes his worldview. What was the big issue at the Peace Conference, and how did Keynes relate to it?
So Keynes is very upset about the war itself, and his friends in Bloomsbury are telling him, please quit your job, stop being part of the British war machine. This is a pointless war, it's about nothing. And Keynes largely agrees with them, but he sees the peace conference as this opportunity to set Europe and the world on a path toward mutual prosperity and sort of cooperative diplomacy. That instead of having these economic and military disputes that erupt in these terrible conflicts, we can establish a basis for exchange and understanding that will prevent things like this from happening. And at the peace conference, he sees the exact opposite happening, not only from, say, the German delegation or the American delegation, but from his own delegation from Great Britain. And he sees the conference unfolding as sort of an effort at resource extraction. There are these very, very heavy reparations duties that are being assigned to Germany, who is sort of saddled with responsibility for the war. And he says, look, whoever you think is at fault for this war, there's no way we can actually make Germany pay this amount of money. The accounting identity of $300 billion or whatever the particular sum was at the time just doesn't correspond to actual resources in Germany. So if you make them pay this amount of money, you're going to depress world trade and overall global economic output, which is going to make it harder for economies around the world to recover from the destruction they've just endured. And he views the war debts that have accrued over the course of the war the same way. Great Britain owes an enormous amount of money to the United States. France owes an enormous amount of money to both Great Britain and the United States. These countries are not going to be able to get back on their feet and start doing the things that economies do, like making food and building railroads and making hospitals and all the rest, if they have to keep shipping money overseas to international creditors. And what's worse, if they're shipping this money abroad, that function will breed enmity between nations. There will be internal disharmony and internal suffering and deprivation, and that will breed external anger and xenophobia. And so he believes that Europe is setting itself up for both domestic dictatorship and international conflict. And he's totally disappointed in his government. He's completely devastated by this, and he writes this scathing critique of the treaty called The Economic Consequences of the Peace, which is a very technical title, and it sounds like a very sleepy book. But even a century later, I think it reads like a bestseller. It's just this completely scathing and at times thrilling and in certain ways beautiful book about political failure, not just arithmetic economic miscalculation.
So I want to skip ahead a little bit. It's the middle of the Great Depression. Keynes writes his masterpiece, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money. I've tried and failed to read it twice, and now I don't have to because you provided an incredibly clear-eyed account and gripping account of it. his ideas are taken up by FDR's New Deal, the Beveridge Report in the UK. The Keynesian revolution is in full bloom. You know, what do you, Zach, see as the sort of major accomplishments and legacies of that moment?
Yeah, the general theory is a very funny book because in a lot of ways, the policies that we associate with the general theory, like deficit spending, like the public works of FDR's New Deal, the WPA, and all of these, you know, major institutions spending all this money to sort of democratize the prosperity that the United States economy was capable of producing. He was advocating for those policies before he wrote the general theory. The general theory is sort of this book that provides intellectual justification by winning over the economics profession. He's able to persuade the intellectuals in government, in finance, in the economics profession that this is the right way to do things. He has already had this view of what should be done for quite some time, since at least 1929. The legacy of that book, though, is that he opens up a sort of realm of government action by talking about markets as something that are not independent of the government itself. He views money and commerce as sort of something that is created by the state. Even money itself is this tool of governance, the same way that you know, the military is or the police force is, and that without the state, you can't have a functional economy. So the idea of the government stepping back and letting the economy do its own thing is kind of incoherent to Keynes. There's always economic management happening, and if you refuse to manage the economy, you're going to get what he calls an equilibrium of underemployment, which is this very nice way of saying an economy that sucks.
The technical term for that.
Right. And so people are persuaded by this in the economics profession, and in Britain, you know, one of the most enduring aspects of his policy legacy is the socialization of British medicine. He's the financial architect of the Beveridge Plan, which creates the British National Health Service, which creates pretty much all of the modern foundations of the British welfare state, which is much more expansive than the welfare state in the United States. And in fact, at the time, is very, very controversial because people like Friedrich Hayek and other intellectuals who, like Keynes, see themselves as inheritors of this Enlightenment liberal tradition, think that Britain is going down what Hayek calls the road to serfdom, that by socializing medicine, they're one step closer to Soviet dictatorship, that gulags and butchery are just right around the corner. And Keynes says, no, if you don't do this sort of thing, then the liberal ideals that we care about, like individual liberty, freedom of conscience, free artistic expression, all of that will be erased by dictatorship because people won't stand. Governments will not be able to stand if people are not taken care of, and they will fall to dictatorships, to authoritarians who will come in and say, look, I can set things right and I will fix things for you. And so he becomes a very controversial figure on the right, because the right sees him as essentially indistinguishable from Marxists and socialists. And yet to Keynes, he understands himself very much as being somebody who is inheriting this tradition from Edmund Burke, from Jean-Jacques Rousseau, as part of this Enlightenment lineage.
So just as these ideas are being taken up and implemented by governments around the world, Keynes has a heart attack and he dies. It's 1946. He's 62 years old, still, you know, not an old man. And this is about 2/3 of the way into your book, and then your book becomes something quite different, which is sort of a biography of an idea, really, the idea of Keynesianism. And you know, at least here in the U.S., you know, it both becomes sort of the dominant economic paradigm. We're all Keynesians now, but also you argue kind of like a weak sauce version of itself. What happens as it sort of gets disseminated and taken up here in the U.S.?
So the reason people like Friedrich Hayek are alarmed by Keynes is because there's stuff in his writing, including the writing that's embraced by the economics profession, that is very radical. he has a line at the end of the general theory where he says, you know, in order to ensure economic stability, we're going to have some sort of general socialization of investment. And by investment, he doesn't mean just like stuff that happens on Wall Street. He means the actual investment in new equipment and new ideas that corporations do on a regular basis. He thinks that's going to be something that's going to have to generally be under social control. Now, he's very vague about what he means by this, but later in his life, by the 1940s, he's thinking about 2/3 of the economy is probably going to be consisting of government-directed spending. And that is a very radical prospect to people, particularly at the time. And I mean, I think it's a little bit radical even now. I think about 20% of US GDP is government spending right now. At the time, it was more like 4 or 5%. So this is a dramatic change in economic organization that Keynes is talking about. That change doesn't happen. The Keynesianism that becomes what people like Paul Krugman talk about in the New York Times, what you learn about in Econ 101, is sort of diluted or beaten back, really, I think, by the outbreak of McCarthyism at the end of World War II. We think of McCarthyism as this kind of excessive action by one senator who was scapegoating some people unfairly, but it's really this general right-wing reaction to all of the changes that Roosevelt had implemented over the previous dozen years, which were quite radical changes in the organization of society and also in the power structure between different peoples. There are economists now who are sort of the key figures in policymaking by the end of World War II. That wasn't true before Roosevelt. There were bankers who were the key figures in policymaking, and if you'd gone to the right school and majored in poetry and then went and worked for the right bank, you were just as qualified to be a Treasury Secretary as you would be if you had become, you know, if you were John Maynard Keynes. And that changes after the war, and there's this sort of academicization of elite knowledge, and you also have this expanded social access to knowledge because of the GI Bill. So all these people are going to college. All of a sudden, it's not just this, you know, this reserve for super wealthy children of privilege. Suddenly, you know, everybody who either served in the war or who had parents who served in the war, which is an enormous number of people in the United States, can go to college, can get a house. Obviously, this is not implemented equally across racial lines. So a lot of the benefits of the GI Bill are simply denied to Black Americans, but many of them are not. And that integration of higher ed along both racial and class lines is very threatening to the sort of conservative establishment. And they push back against Keynes as sort of representative of this social change and say, you know, if we keep doing this, our society is going to be unrecognizable to us. And so the Keynesian economists say, look, I'm not some crazy socialist. I'm not some terrible Marxist who wants to, you know, make sure that every Black student in America gets a college degree. I just, you know, want to make sure that we have deficit spending so unemployment doesn't get out of control, right, and we don't have revolutions in a depression. And that becomes the sort of normalized consensus view of what Keynes is. And this is before the internet. You know, he has all of these writings that are available in which his social views are not a secret. But the general theory is a very dense book. It's very difficult. Unlike the rest of his work, it's kind of I call it like a thorny pretzel. It's just a nasty read. And so not that many people really read it. They read interpretations of it. And in fact, economists win Nobel Prizes for making interpretations of specific chapters from the general theory. And that's what the economics profession then does afterwards. They don't go back to the text itself.
So skip way ahead now to the financial crisis of 2008, right? So the housing market's taken a dive, subprime contagion is spreading like wildfire, Lehman Brothers goes bankrupt. You argue that the response to this from the Bush administration and the Obama administration is a kind of form of Keynesianism. They're using the tools of Keynesianism to prop up the economy, but in a way without pursuing those Keynesian ideals. What went wrong there, in your view?
So Keynes is not somebody who wants the government to spend enough money. He does. He says you have to make sure you spend money so that you do things, but it matters what the government is actually doing. And he has this vision of society, which is essentially Bloomsbury in 1913. He wants all of the world to look like what it was like to live in Bloomsbury at the time. This is, drinking champagne while Virginia Woolf cuts your hair and you debate poetry with Pablo Picasso. I mean, this is what he wants everybody to do. And by the end of the war, he's not just socializing British medicine, he's behind a project to build community theaters in every single county in England with local playwrights and local actors. This is before television, so community theater is a big deal at this period of time. This is how people will socialize publicly, how they will experience art and entertainment. He is really, really committed to this idea that Bloomsbury can be something that everybody enjoys. In 2008, we spent a lot of money. There was this enormous bank bailout, the one authorized by Congress, also the one authorized by the Federal Reserve, which is much more expansive.
Yep.
But the things that the money was spent on, it's not obvious to me that those, in fact, it's clear to me that those were not the most pressing priorities at the time. We let a lot of people go, and we saved a lot of people who were very wealthy. And that created, I think, a kind of crisis not only of economics, where we had a very slow recovery, because of course we didn't rescue the people who needed rescuing, but we created a political crisis where people lost their faith in the government. They could see that the government was willing to move heaven and earth to save the richest people in the country. But when it came to struggling homeowners who were trying to make ends meet, disproportionately black homeowners and homeowners of color, we just didn't have the same level of attention. And this was true even with the Democratic president, even under the first black president. And so I think it made a lot of people lose faith in the ability of the American democracy and the American political system to deliver for people. And I think part of that is a reason why Donald Trump became elected in 2016. But I think it also has contributed to just a general sense of social unrest and unease. There's a sense in which the American community, which has always been fractured in important ways, but that it is more fractured since 2008, not because of the crisis, but because of the way the government responded to it.
So I want to ask you one
here. Oh, yeah, sorry. I don't need to interrupt, but I just want to let folks know, if you're on the call today, check your chat function. Someone from HuffPost may have reached out. So check it now.
Thank you, Laura. I want to ask you, Zach, just one quick last question before we toss it over to the audience. So, looking at the crisis today, Congress has spent an unprecedented $2 trillion on a stimulus package. Democrats are offering another $3 trillion. You've been a pretty stern critic of what's on offer here. We know what Zach Carter thinks. What would Keynes think? What would Keynes do?
It's always hard to, resurrect the dead man. But I think the issue for Keynes would have been not the dollars and cents, not the debt, not even things like GDP or unemployment, but the big picture for social harmony in the United States, and then also in the world. He'd be looking at our relationship with China and asking some pretty hard questions about what's going on there. He'd be looking at climate change coming down the pike and saying this is a pretty serious issue, and he'd be looking at inequality and saying, you have people in this country just don't feel like they're part of the same political project, and unless you heal that, you're not going to be able to address those bigger challenges internationally or globally. But he would try, he would favor a very large response to this crisis. He'd want the United States to address the public health aspect of it first. So, making sure we have masks and ventilators and nurses and contact tracers, and having the government train people directly to do that, not just.
You think he would have nationalized all that in?
Certainly, the supply chain for essential equipment he would have nationalized, so that you don't have different hospitals bidding against each other for the same equipment. He was not doctrinaire about what particular policy was right at any given moment. He wasn't against nationalization, but he didn't think that it was a cure-all for every single problem. I think he would have been very critical of the disproportionate amount of political power that certain economic interests have. I think he would have found the health insurance system just totally disgusting in the United States. But he would have looked at the crisis as an opportunity not only to address the economic downturn, but to address other problems that are pressing. So spend a lot of money, but spend it on things that grapple with climate change. Spend it in ways that grapple with inequality. Use the crisis to address other problems so that you don't have to just keep coming back and doing this over and over and over again, so that in 5 or 6 years we can all be enjoying our books and having our haircut
and our champagne.
Yeah,
that sounds good to me. Let's launch the last poll here. The U.S. Congress is debating a $3 trillion stimulus package. which would add to trillions that's already spent. Some conservatives are worried about the size of the federal deficit. Is deficit spending something you're concerned about now? A, very much, B, a little bit, or C, not at all? We'll take your answers here. And Lauren, do you have a question from the audience for Zach?
Yeah, I actually do. Thanks, Richard, and thanks, Zach. Just a reminder to everyone, if you have a question, you can click on participants and click the raise hand icon. And also, please check your chat feature. One of our moderators may have already reached out to you. It's so great to see so many people on here, so many Zach fans, so many HuffPost fans. And we received so many questions ahead of the event today in our pre-registration questions. So we're going to go to that first before we take up a live question. And the first one comes from Stephanie Paz Townsend. She asks, what can we as a public do differently by learning from the Keynes history?
It's a really great question, Stephanie. I think the thing that Keynes would want people to take away from his life and career is that economics is not this special sphere only for super experts who understand everything so much more clearly than ordinary people do. Economics is part of the political agenda of democracy. It's something that everybody has a stake in, and it's central to the political process of democracy. The things that economists do are often quite sophisticated and quite complex, and Keynes had a very high opinion of himself as a man who was capable of deciphering these highfalutin equations. But he also believed that these were things that the public was capable of understanding. He thought that eventually his ideas would triumph because people would be persuaded by them, that they would understand the ideas, and that this would become his views would become a consensus opinion in a democratic society. And I think it's important to understand that economics is a very dangerous science if it's left in the hands of a privileged few, and is not something that we all sort of grapple with as a fundamental piece of our politics.
All right, thanks for that question, Stephanie. We have another question, and this one comes live. And Ronald Brenner, you're up next. We're going to unmute you, and just introduce yourself and let us know where you're from and give us your question.
Yes, Ron Gruner. I'm in Naples, Florida right now. The temperature is a very pleasant 92 degrees. And Zach, I'm enjoying your talk and looking forward to buying your book. My question is simple. What's the relationship between this new idea of modern monetary theory with Keynesian theory, and what's your outlook for this incredible growing deficit we're seeing here in the United States?
So I view MMT, look, I don't speak for MMTers. I'm not an official member of the club, but I'm friendly with a lot of people who do MMT. And I see it essentially as a sort of rebranding of a particular vision of Keynesian thought with a whole lot of technical observations about the way the Federal Reserve and the US Treasury function. So it's a very specific, detailed interpretation of Keynes, which I think, some iterations of it I think are a little bit silly, but for the most part I think it's about right. You don't have to worry about debt as an accounting relationship. You need to worry about debt in the context of inflation, and you need to worry about the real resource capacities of society. So what matters, what's going to cause an economic crisis in the United States is not how large the federal deficit is or how large the national debt is, but our access to actual goods and services. So, we would see inflation in meat prices, for instance, if we can't produce enough meat. So it's important to make sure we mobilize real resources in such a way that we can produce enough meat that prices don't go through the roof. It's a reorientation of economic thought onto the resource capacities of the country, the people, and the resources that make up the economy, away from the accounting relationships, which I think have traditionally dominated economic policymaking, which are relationships about debt and deficits.
But if I can ask a follow-up question, the United States is in a unique position because the dollar is the reserve currency of the world, and we're able to issue dollars pretty much at will. What happens if the world, say starting with China or some other situation occurs where the dollar loses, where people lose confidence in the dollar and begin to reject American debt? What happens after that? And there's just too many dollars chasing too few goods.
The short answer is we don't know. because we have not been in a position where the reserve currency has been rejected like that since the end of the gold standard. But I think the issue here is that there is an almost infinite demand for dollars right now. So the idea that that countries would reject dollars because we're creating too many of them, I think is a little bit confused. Everybody wants to get their hands on dollars. Interest rates are at record lows. There's no shortage of interest, not in the percentage sense, but in you know the desire to have sense from international investors for more dollars. So we're not going to see a crisis of confidence because we're creating too much debt. I do think you could have a crisis of confidence because of political dysfunction. So things like the debt ceiling debate that happened repeatedly during the Obama administration when the United States talked about defaulting on its debt. I think that's pretty dangerous. I think Lindsey Graham even making sort of vague asides on cable news that maybe we're not going to pay back all of our debt to China and we're going to cancel that debt is something that's very destabilizing. But even if we did lose control of the dollar as a reserve currency, the United States still has a central bank. It still has the Federal Reserve. It has control over its currency. It can't run out of money the way that it could under the gold standard, when every dollar was tied to a certain amount of a specific resource, and that was gold. Then we have to worry about things like inflation, but we don't have to worry about bankruptcy or the inability to make good on existing commitments to seniors under Medicare or Social Security, or to people who are trying to feed their families on food stamps.
Hey guys, I just want to hop in here and just remind folks to please check their chat feature. It's at the bottom of your screen, your Zoom screen. Some of our moderators may have reached out. And I think we have the final results of that last poll. Richard, if you want to kind of talk to it.
I don't have them. Can you put them up?
Yeah.
Oh, there we go.
Yeah.
18% very much worried, 36% a little bit, and 46% not at all. Interesting.
Yeah.
Good response.
So we have some time left, about 15 minutes left here, and we'd love to hear from more of you. So raise your hand if you haven't yet, the virtual hand, and also check your HuffPost chat there. So we have a next question from Nola Caffery, and Nola, we're going to bring you up live. Let us know where you're from.
I'm from Holland. I live in Hilversum. And I studied international public law in Utrecht here. And I was absolutely horrified in the first lecture that they began by saying in Dutch, so I can't read. They said, our first assumption is that the needs of the consumer are infinite. I was horrified. And all of the I was there as a mature student, and all of the 18-year-olds were writing this down. And I thought, well, first of all, common sense indicates that's not true. And second of all, why are we starting on that with the first lecture? And so actually, that's not my question. That was just my experience here in Holland. Greetings from Holland. God bless you all. My question is this. The Cold War ended, and we had capitalists versus communists and socialists and all of that idealistic stuff. But behind that is that actually we had developed a false dichotomy in our thinking that cooperation and competition are mutually exclusive. Obviously, we're doing both all the time. And so what we are not doing is consciously weighing in each set of decisions, how are we going to compete and how are we going to cooperate, for instance, in healthcare, in infrastructure and so forth. But the thing is, that the reason we haven't been able to solve much of anything since the end of the Cold War is because we still have this wall between our ears, that there's a mutually exclusive dichotomy. And so every time someone wants to say, let's cooperate in this aspect, for instance, everybody is part of the national insurance scheme.
I think you're getting to two things there, if you don't mind me jumping in here, that I think are really central to the way Keynes thought about the world.
Yes.
Your point about the consumer's needs being infinite, I think, the sort of central premise of economics that we learn in 101 is that there are limited resources and unlimited wants. And Keynes said that's not actually the central problem that we're pursuing. We live in an age of heretofore unimaginable abundance. He said in the Economic Consequences of the Peace, this is before televisions and radio and mass production and all the things that happened in the 20th century. He says, we have treasures for the middle class that would have been unimaginable to the monarchs of other ages. He thinks that the issue for economic humanity, for the economic individual, is not rational maximization of profit under conditions of scarce resources. He thinks it's uncertainty. It's the inability to understand and know what is coming next around the future. And he thinks that the development of economics as a mathematical science, while it's very useful and practical in developing policymaking, creates this false sense of certainty and belief about what's going to happen. I think very few of us saw COVID-19 coming. I think it was pretty clear when Donald Trump was elected president that this was going to be a rocky road, but I certainly didn't have global pandemic on my checklist. There is always something bad coming around the pike to Keynes that we don't know about, and that is going to disrupt our expectations. And how do you make a rational decision in the present without access to that kind of thinking? So if you do economics in the way that Keynes is thinking about it, it has to be more of a social science. It has to be a set of rules of thumb. It has to be a political science, more so than a mathematical science and a region of sort of physics-like certainty, the way that it's taught in intro classes. Now, to be fair to the economics profession, after Econ 101, they tell graduate students, everything that you learn in Econ 101 is just not true, and we don't really believe that. But you have to ask yourselves, why is it that we indoctrinate everybody with this set of beliefs to begin with? Now, as with the sort of dichotomy between socialism and communism, I myself find this very frustrating, because when you read through Keynes, it's very clear that at times he thinks of himself as a socialist, at times he thinks of himself as a capitalist. He believes in sort of a liberal socialism, I think, that something that honors the individual liberties that he finds so valuable about the 19th century, but that enables people to enjoy shared prosperity, that looks at the economy not from the perspective of like atomized individuals making decisions that somehow get summed up, but from the good of the whole. And even that perspective, I think, was a new way of thinking about the economy at the time. The word macroeconomics hadn't been developed yet and was largely developed as people interpreted Keynes over the 1940s. So I think today, there are people like Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek who thought that progressive taxation was socialism. They thought that public education was socialism. In the United States, that seems a little bit silly to us, I think, and yet that's what they believed. And so today, when we talk about whether a policy is good or bad because it's socialist or communist or capitalist, I think we have to be really clear what we're saying here. There are policies that benefit certain groups of society, and there are policies that don't. And if you're trying to do something that benefits working people, I think that's often derided as a socialist policy. But that doesn't mean that you're reinventing 1919 USSR Soviet Russia. I mean, you're just doing something that's designed to benefit certain classes of people.
Thanks so much, Zach. And thanks for that great question. We have another person that's up live. I'll just remind everybody to try to keep their questions to 30 seconds or less, just so we can get everybody's questions in today. So up next is Chris Zenekas. Chris, you're up. Let us know where you're from.
I think Chris is muted.
Hey, is Chris there? Chris is muted. Okay. All right. Well, while we figure out Chris' situation, we also have. Oh, Chris, you there?
I'm good. Hi. Can you hear me?
Awesome. What's up, Chris?
Yeah. Hi. I'm from Cortland, New York, and I'm doing some writing on the origins of the Pax Americana, and maybe this is a little bit of a later and sadder part of Keynes' career. I'm interested in the question of how Keynes viewed the purpose and the goals of the Bretton Woods conference in 1944. I know he had trouble with Morgenthau and Harry Dexter White. Did Keynes view Bretton Woods as an essential thing that would help the world, or did he view it maybe more as some ill-conceived effort on the part of the Americans to transform a Pax Britannica into a Pax Americana?
I think the answer is both. He goes into Bretton Woods with Bretton Woods is this financial conference at the end of World War II, where the sort of economic terms of the post-war order are established. And Keynes goes in with this very almost utopian kind of cooperative vision, where countries that go into economic surplus, countries that enjoy the benefits of imbalances in trade and in capital distribution, are required to participate in bringing balance to their relationships with other countries. So if you have a big deficit, it's not just on you to make sure that you get back to balance with this country by implementing austerity policies. The country that's got this big surplus has to help lift you up. You don't just have to push yourself down. So that is a very it's an ambitious program, and it would have reset power between nations around the world, because the most powerful nations, the creditor nations like the United States, would have been giving up a lot of their economic power in order to give it over not just to fading empires like Great Britain, but to post-colonial nations that were just sort of coming into their own at the time. That vision essentially loses out at Bretton Woods to the American vision proposed by Harry Dexter White. And the American vision is essentially dollar hegemony with two bailout funds. And the bailout funds are the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. And this is before the IMF and the World Bank are sort of these paragons of austerity thinking. For several years in the early years of the Bretton Woods institutions, they're operating in much more, I think, humane and what we'd consider today a progressive way than they become famous for later on. Keynes believes that the deal that he gets at Bretton Woods is the best that the world can hope for. He fights very hard for his own vision and doesn't get it. But he thinks that the Americans, even though he's never really liked the United States very much, he thinks it's just oppressively hot here. We don't have enough birds in the countryside. We're brash and rude and all of that. But he thinks that there is a tradition of sort of liberal, individual, Enlightenment liberalism here, which means that even if if the world is stuck with American leadership, that tradition it's better to sort of work within that tradition than without it. And so he fights very hard to make sure that the Bretton Woods deal is ratified by Britain, who, a lot of his colleagues in Britain think it's a raw deal and that they shouldn't do it. And ultimately it is ratified. I think he would have been really horrified by the United States' decision to abandon that system in 1971 when Richard Nixon leaves the gold standard, sort of, but he's really just leaving the Bretton Woods system. We have had an era of American hegemony ever since Bretton Woods, and it has been sort of been reinvented in the 1990s by the globalization regime with WTO and NAFTA and the various international trade agreements. But those are deals they're sort of about financializing the world economy. And the United States had quite a bit of say in implementing those arrangements, and it was sort of an attempt to make economic standards around the world similar to the economic standards that we have in the United States right now. And I think the social upheaval that we're seeing right now in places like Minneapolis today, but that we've been seeing for quite some time, frankly, is a product in part of those economic arrangements. So I think Keynes would be even though he was a committed internationalist who believed deeply in cross-border economic connections, he would say that the type of international system that has developed since the collapse of Bretton Woods is a very troubling one.
Great. Thank you so much, Zach. And thanks, Chris, for that question. We have another question, this time from Candace Hinson. Candace, you're on live. Let us know where you're from.
Tallahassee, Florida. And it's an overcast day here, but it's still pleasant. And thank you for taking my question. I have been interested in economic inequality for a long time, probably 40 years. And I have some familiarity with the census data on this. And if you look at the quintiles or fifths of the population that get a proportion of the total income, the top 20% have been getting an increasingly large number of this percentage of this income since the 1930s when the measure was begun. So I'm curious as to whether Zach sees Keynes as having any being able to shed any light on this, even though it's a domestic problem as I'm looking at it. Of course, it's global as well. But what Keynes might have to say about economic inequality and the fact that it tends to grow regardless of the politics of the country.
It's a great question, Candy. People should know that I've known Candy for many, many years. Yes. This is a remarkable thing. I had no hand in selecting her for this question, but she's a friend of my mother's.
Well, and let me say, fantastic scholarship, Zach. I'm so proud.
Thank you, Candy. Well, this is a terrific question. Thomas Piketty's book, Capital, that came out a few years ago, is a remarkable piece of scholarship, which showed, of course, economic inequality essentially escalating around the world, regardless of national boundaries, essentially all the time. And I think that a major criticism of that work, which I think was a really important work, but a major criticism was that, well, this is not taking into account the way that policy affects the income distribution. And I think for Keynes, he was a moral thinker as much as he was an economic thinker. And so he believed that inequality was a problem just for its own sake. He thought that it was bad for some people to have a lot and other people to not have very much. And he also thought that excessive amounts of wealth were sort of tacky, kind of gross. He believed that the thing you were supposed to do with money was spend it on nice things. You should go buy a painting. You should go to the theater. You should buy a string of pearls. But if you just have large amounts of money in your bank account, you're sort of doing it wrong. You're living the wrong way. It's evidence that you're refusing to live life to the fullest. But he also believed that economic inequality, he came to believe that economic inequality was economically harmful, that it made society not function, it made markets not function in the ways that were particularly productive. So when he wrote the general theory in 1936, he says, look, this shows that if people don't have enough money, they can't buy the things that the economy produces. And if they can't buy the things that the economy produces, then the economy can't produce things. So he believes he's removed a barrier to the removal of large inequalities of wealth by saying that they're actually harmful to economic prosperity, to economic growth. He's not against inequality in all circumstances. He doesn't see why it matters that much if somebody has a little bit more than another. But he says, we should be able to remove vast inequalities of wealth such as those that exist today. Now, that was 1936 when he wrote that. Today in the United States, we have a much more unequal society than we did in 1936. I think there's a very good book by two economists at the University of California at Berkeley, Emmanuel Saez and Gabriel Zucman, which makes pretty clear that tax policy alone contributes to most of that economic inequality difference. But I do think one critique that I have with of their book is that there's a reason why the tax policy looks the way it does. There are imbalances in economic and political power between different people, and the interests of the wealthy are represented in our government in ways that the interests of everybody else are not. So when you have high concentrations of wealth, high concentrations of power in particular sectors at major firms, you end up with more economic inequality and the inability for the political system to do the things that would alleviate that inequality. So, I mean, Zucman and Saez are talking about 70% tax rates on the wealthy. They're talking about a wealth tax, which both Senators Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders talked about in the 2020 campaign. And they think those are really necessary to bringing back a sense of social stability and social harmony in much the same way that I think Keynes would have talked about inequality. He said he wouldn't have thought of inequality as, he would have emphasized that inequality is a mathematical metaphor, not a mathematical relationship. It's a social relationship. Inequality is what happens when a police officer murders somebody in broad daylight on camera and feels like he's allowed to do that. It's not just the difference in how much money you have in a bank account. That's an accounting way of trying to represent that deeper social relationship.
Zach, yeah, thank you so much for that. We have time for one last question. And this comes from Patrick Kwan. Patrick, if you can keep your question to 30 seconds or less, that would be great. Patrick, you're up. Just let us know where you're from.
Hi, I'm from New York City. I was wondering about what Keynes may say about the lack of ability for local governments, such as New York City or even New York State, to borrow and utilize debt.
It is a very good question. You know, Keynes thought about economics from the perspective of sort of a British imperial manager because he came of age professionally running British war finance in World War I. And he thought about the economy as sort of a single social project that was bound by the borders of the nation state. So if we were going to be in a democracy together, then this was our collective project. And I think he was baffled by a lot of the just sort of technical intricacies of American politics in Washington, but I think he was really perplexed by the sort of quasi-federalist system that we have. The idea that the federal government doesn't just automatically take care of deep social problems as a matter of course, but leaves many of them up to state and local governments. I'm not sure he would have supported the sort of disaggregated system of power that we have. But given that that we do, you know, he was a big believer in central banking. I think he would have wanted the Federal Reserve to have some sort of ability to work with local governments. If you were going to be stuck with that power arrangement, he would want the central bank to be able to do economic policy making in a way that was actually conducive to prosperity. You know, he didn't think that his innovations in central banking that he worked out over the course of his career, which predate the general theory, are about thinking about new ways for the central bank to operate. And his thinking is not doctrinarian thinking. It's not, he didn't think that he'd written sort of like a biblical text that everybody had to go back to find specific answers for everything. It's more that he had a way of thinking about the economy and of believing that you could use economic thinking to pursue a particular vision of prosperity. So I think he'd be talking about today things like, you know, if you're stuck with New York City and New York State not having enough money in a crisis, well, you know, if the Fed can buy bonds from corporate America, then certainly it could buy bonds from the New York City government, or it could provide non-recourse loans to the government, which are essentially grants. And so I think he'd be thinking about creative ways for the federal central bank to ease some of those problems from a disaggregated system.
Thanks, Patrick, and thanks so much, Zach. We really enjoyed this today. We're sorry we couldn't get to everyone's questions. I'm just personally overwhelmed by all the wonderful questions and just seeing all of you on our Zoom call today. Before we let you go, we have one other poll and we'd love for you to take. It's about membership and it's about more virtual events like this. We can launch that poll. Which of these potentially ticketed workshops would you be most interested in or likely to attend? We have one on fact checking. What about parenting, re-entry to work, sex ed for adults, the future of work, and mental health. So while that poll's running, I just want to give you a heads up on our next event, which is slated for June 8th. It's a workshop on misinformation and media literacy, which is super timely right now. So the event is $5 for non-members and it's free for HuffPost members. Just a reminder, that basic membership gets you into the HuffPost community. You get to comment on our stories, take part in online forums. You'll receive personal invites and discounts to ticketed events as well. And by the way, the first 30 members who signed up for today's event will be getting a free digital copy of Zach's book. And if you're selected, you'll get a notification email within the next week. So be on the lookout for that. And I just want to remind everyone, let's grab that poll. Let's see what folks are thinking about on that poll. Okay, we got 80% fact checking. Well, you're in luck because that's happening June 8th. We have parenting, re-entry to the workplace, sex ed for adults. And, you know, we also have mental health, 32%. So we'll be keeping an eye on that and stay tuned for more details. All right, one last thing. If you want to financially support the work we're doing here and you're able to do so, considering joining HuffPost Plus as a monthly or annual paid member. And lastly, we would love to hear what you think about today's event. So you'll be getting a survey in your email. And don't forget, Zach's book is out now and it's on sale wherever you buy books. Richard, thanks for leading such an amazing discussion today. And Zach, thanks so much for everything.
Well, thank you guys so much for watching. I hope, of course, that you'll buy the book, but if you won't buy the book, that today's discussion would at least help you pretend that you had with your friends the next time you can go to a cocktail party or something like that, given the pandemic. So best of luck to all of you.
Bye now. Thanks, everyone.